All right, so in this video, we're going to discuss two-dimensional midpoint. We've already discussed the Pythagorean theorem and two-dimensional distance. This video is going to be pretty short. 2D midpoint is by no means a difficult concept. So here we go. So first, let's motivate where we're coming from, right? So if we have 2 points in two-dimensional space, namely A and B, we'll say, right, such that point A is x1, y1, point B is x2, y2. Well, we're going to use a little bit of trigonometry again here to try and come to terms with what it is we're looking for, right? So we already have discussed, we easily can find the distance between A and B, right? That's no problem. But what if I wanted to know not the distance between them, but the point halfway right between them uh, on a two-dimensional path like so, right? So here in a two-dimensional coordinate plane. Okay, so that's easier said than done, but once we look at it, right? So if we add the third point C right here, and we say, point C is, we'll say let's just redefine it in one dimension, right? So let's say here's x1, here's x2, right? And then same idea with y. So here is y1 and here is y2, right? So if we look for the halfway point in one dimension, so the distance between x1 and x2, right, would be in this case 20, it looks like, because we're going from -10 to +10. But let's pretend we didn't know that, right? If we wanted to know the midpoint, the precise midpoint, which would be right here, well, all we'd have to do is x1 plus x2 all divided by 2. That would give us our x midpoint, right? And likewise, we could apply that same logic here to find our y midpoint, right? So we could say our y midpoint is going to exist, well, where it would always exist at y1 plus y2 all divided by 2. And when we converge at our actual for real midpoint here, and I'll use green, we see that our x midpoint is quite literally our x midpoint, and our y midpoint is quite literally our y midpoint. So our point right here exists wherever our x midpoint and our y midpoint happen, because we are, after all, in two-dimensional space, and therefore we must have an x coordinate and a y coordinate. Okay, so let's do an actual example here. So on this first example, we say that point A is at 16 by 20. So we'll say about right there 16, and about right there, maybe a little further, about right there is 20. So that's our point A here at 16 by 20. Okay, and point B is at -26 by +36. So we'll say 36 is up off to the side here. So there's point B at -26 by +36, right? And we're looking, of course, for the midpoint between them, right? So if we label, we're going to say x1, y1, x2, y2, right? It doesn't matter, right, what order I label those in. So I kind of went backwards according to what we're seeing here, but on the graph, it makes more sense to label it this way. Doesn't really matter. Okay, here in a second, we'll do it completely just without any visual like what I've got here, and just the numbers will make sense. Okay, so I know my midpoint is somewhere in this area, right? But obviously, I'm not perfect. I'm not a robot, and I didn't draw this perfectly, right? So my x-axis is kind of crooked, y-axis likewise. And I can't really tell if I'm going to be over here in quadrant 2 or in quadrant 1. So I'm going to do the math. Okay, so two-dimensional midpoint, we know, is simply given as the x midpoint, comma, the y midpoint. right? So our midpoint is going to be an ordered pair, just like what we see here from points A and B. It's going to have an X and a Y coordinate, and more importantly, an X midpoint and a Y midpoint, right? So let's look and see what that means here. Okay, so let's start with the X midpoint, right? So that's going to be X1, right, which is negative 26, plus X2, which is positive 16, all over 2. Quick maths tells us that's going to be negative 10 over 2, right? And then divide that out, that gives us just negative 5. So my X midpoint happens here at negative 5. Okay? Well, then let's look at our Y midpoint now, right? So our Y midpoint, we're going from 20 right here, even though I kind of missed the line. We're going from 20 up to here at 36. Okay, so let's do the math there. So Y1 is 36 plus Y2 is 20 all over 2. 36 plus 20 is 56, so we have 56 over 2. 56 over 2 will reduce down to 28. So I have my coordinates here. So this would be at 28, which we'll say is about right there. And if we just follow it and converge here with our X midpoint, right? We see they both converge right there. And that would be my midpoint. It exists at negative 5 by positive 28. Okay? So now let's do it just with the math, right? So we've gotten more or less a visual on how this is going to work, but let's look at just the math, focus on just the algebra that goes to this. So we see geometrically speaking, I mean, all we're doing is looking for the midpoint in 2 dimensions, quite literally. Okay? So if I just label x1, y1, x2, y2, right? So I'm looking for my midpoint in 2 dimensions. Again, that's given in 2 dimensions. We have to find the x dimensions midpoint and also the y dimensions midpoint, right? So we're just going to plug in numbers where they go. So negative 37 plus negative 15, all of that over 2. Negative 37 plus negative 15, that would be, what would that be? Negative 52 over 2, which of course is negative 26. So that's my x midpoint, right? And then my y midpoint that I'm going to find right here next to it. So y1 plus y2, which is negative 7, all of that over 2. That's going to give me negative 9 over 2. That won't reduce any further, but if we like decimals, right, we're going to say negative 4.5 or negative 4.5. So all we're saying again is, so if I've got, 1 point at negative 37 by negative 2, right? So we're going to say that that point exists, and I'm going to have to erase this here. That point exists right there. That's my point A, right? And point B is at negative 15 by negative 7. So we'll say negative 7's up here, little boys, right? So our midpoint right in between them, right, would exist right there. That would be our midpoint in 2D. It would happen right in between points A and B, right, at negative 26 by 4.5. Let's do another one. Okay, so x1, y1, x2, y2. Okay, so let's find the x midpoint first. Negative 126 plus 40 all over 2. That's negative 86 over 2, which of course would give me, we call it negative 43. Okay, so that would be my x midpoint. Okay, and then now, well, we need our y midpoint, right? So negative 103 plus 23, all of that over 2. That's going to give me negative 80 over 2, which of course is negative 40, and that would be my y midpoint. So that means my midpoint in 2D is going to be given by negative 43 in dimension x and negative 40 in dimension y. Okay? So for the sake of brevity, I don't think I need to do another example. I mean, this is pretty straightforward. Obviously, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. That concludes this video. Goodbye.